Welcome to the Aero Export Consultants podcast. I'm John Young, and this is The Point. We're approaching the new year, folks, and because of that, I think this is an important time to reflect on some recent changes that have been made to some of our export control regimes, as well as take a look forward at what changes are reported to be coming down the pipe. Earlier this year, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs from the Executive Branch released their agency rule list for the year. Contained within it is a list of the ITAR rule changes that the government is set to review and implement in the coming year. Some of these rules are in the preliminary state and have only been proposed, while others have already had interim final rules in place and will be confirmed with final rules in the coming months, hopefully. But as always, when it comes to these subjects, I can hear the question, does this matter to me? Here on The Point, I always try to show the ways big government actions affect our own businesses down here on the ground, and this episode is no exception. There are ITAR regulations being finalized, being reviewed by the government. I know unarguably that these types of regulation changes have effects on my own neighboring businesses, as Texas is a hotspot for ITAR-registered companies thanks to all of our defense manufacturing. But even if your business does not have an ITAR certification and you don't manufacture or work with ITAR products at all, news and export control regulations are always relevant and should always be observed. Now let's get into these regulations and see what's headed our way. Overall, there are a total of 10 rulemakings planned. I won't be going into all of them in detail, as some primarily consist of language clarification and edits to the ITAR/USML that are mostly for the sake of clarity without any real policy implications. Also, some of these regulations already have interim final rules that I might have covered in a previous episode as part of a different story. I still want to touch on these, however, as they are currently being implemented, and it might be beneficial to posit to you how you think they're working. So let's start off with what I would characterize as the most impactful upcoming rule action, which focuses on some of the regulations updates around space controls. Officially, this rule is centered around USML categories 4 and 15, and the action is described as follows. Quote, in response to public comments, the Department of State proposes to amend the International Traffic in Arms Regulations with respect to controls on launch vehicles, ballistic missiles, and other items in Category 4 of the United States Munitions List, and spacecraft and related items in Category 15 of the USML, to describe more precisely the articles warranting control on the USML. If changes in this area sound familiar, it's because the upcoming action regarding these categories is the creation of an interim final rule, meaning this rule already has been proposed. Originally submitted in October 2024 with the comment period ending in November 2024, this rule is scheduled now to receive an IFR and be implemented. The rule itself proposes to amend the ITAR to revise USML categories 4 and 15 and related sections of the ITAR to clarify and standardize the regulatory text, add items that warrant designation on the USML, and remove those items that no longer warrant designation on the USML. The department further proposes to add 3 new license exemptions to the ITAR. When the department says that they want to clarify and standardize regulatory text, they mean to take a few specific actions in this case. First, they want to revise and remove certain note sections in Section 121 of the ITAR, moving some information to the definition section and making the actual ITAR sections easier to read and digest. This is one of the smaller changes I mentioned earlier. In the same vein, there are some sections where they want to remove specially designed as a criterion for certain paragraphs. This might seem like a big deal in some circumstances, but in this case, this action is being taken when the term either, quote, does not narrow the scope of the paragraph or can be replaced with technical criteria that provide more specific control. And again, the stated reason for this change is clarity. In other words, this is not a significant change to standards, merely an alteration for clarity. Some other actions they are taking to standardize the text is to edit how USML paragraphs are structured, aiming for consistency for ease of use. Again, these are the less vital changes, but still important to keep in mind for those of us who have to utilize the USML for our work. The real important aspect of this proposed/interim final rule is the new license exemptions being proposed. There are 3 in total, with a 4th being codified from currently existing notes within the USML. The 3 new proposed exemptions are the Official Space Agency Exemption, the Space Activity Exemption, and the Space Tourism and Research Exemption. The Official Space Agency Exemption would authorize certain transfers of defense articles and defense services when conducted entirely within the scope of an official U.S. government agency space program. The department wants to emphasize that this licensing exemption applies to several NASA spacecraft, but does not extend to the space launch vehicles for these spacecraft. Next, the Space Activity Exemption, quote, would authorize certain transfers of defense articles and Section 120.32A2 defense services supporting space launches. Certain transfers of electrical connectors would be eligible for this exemption, as the department assesses that, while they continue to warrant regulation by this subchapter, certain transfers of these articles may be conducted under a licensing exemption without risk to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. Now, this exemption has 3 additional provisions. The second provision would authorize certain services related to the transmission of space launch vehicle telemetry to improve safety of flight and support the growing space launch industry. The department proposes to limit this authorization to space launch vehicles, since similar data can be used by rockets and missiles to deliver weapons of mass destruction. The third provision would authorize certain services to support collaboration with foreign persons when on-orbit defense articles are utilized in support of fundamental research. And the fourth provision would authorize certain services associated with radio frequency transmissions using on-orbit defense articles, including geolocating certain automated information broadcasts, emergency transmissions, and cellular transmissions. Next, we can move on to the Space Tourism and Research Exemption, which would authorize certain transfers of manned spacecraft for space tourism or in support of fundamental research. The department notes the proposed research exemptions apply specifically to certain basic and applied research, and not to the engineering development phase of research and development. Similarly, they do not apply to the design and development of a defense article or to research either not intended for publication or subject to publication restrictions or non-disclosure agreements. And then the final special licensing provision I mentioned that's not a new rule, but rather a change consistent with existing notes, is for defense articles incorporated into spacecraft subject to the EAR. This exemption would authorize certain transfers of defense articles while they are incorporated into spacecraft subject to the EAR. The rest of the changes laid out in this upcoming interim final rule will deal with USML category revisions. There are too many to go through, so I'd advise that if your ITAR products are categorized in either Category 4 or 15, you check and see for yourself if any changes have been made that could potentially affect your classifications. So that breakdown of the changes coming to Categories 4 and 15 for space controls in the ITAR is definitely the biggest action scheduled for the upcoming year. The next one I want to go over is a bit of a mouthful. It's the corrections and clarifications for export and re-export, Canadian exemptions, exemptions regarding intra-company, intra-organization, and intra-governmental transfers to employees who are dual nationals or third country nationals, and voluntary disclosures. This rule originally proposed in 2022 and will likely have significant changes made to it for the upcoming IFR. The reason I say this is because since 2022, we have had significant changes made to the ITAR in the very areas that this proposed rule had proposed changes. For instance, it still has listed in the language a proposal to revise the definitions of export and re-export, but the locations it lists for those regulations are sections 120.17 and 120.19, when those definitions have already moved to sections 120.50 and 120.51. So already you can see by reading this proposed rule that some of its changes are out of date. And those proposed changes are a big reason for this proposed rule, along with a focus on Canada, replacing the term national with person and Canada's specific exemptions and revisions made to the exemptions for intra-company, intra-organization, and intra-governmental transfers to dual nationals or third country nationals. What I'd say is the biggest change for this upcoming rule implementation is how the definition of export and re-export interacts with dual nationals. The correction is tended for the part that says, quote, any release in the United States of technical data to a foreign person is deemed to be an export to all countries in which the foreign person has held or holds citizenship or holds permanent residency. That's how the rule is currently written. The revision would change it to, quote, any release in the United States of technical data to a foreign person is deemed to be an export to all countries in which the foreign person holds citizenship or permanent residency. It's the department's view that this change will, quote, clarify that any release of technical data to a foreign person described within the respective definitions is a release only to any countries in which that foreign person currently holds citizenship or permanent residency. Up next, we've got a few upcoming rule actions that seem less impactful than the ones I've already gone over, so I'm going to go through them a little quicker. The next rule scheduled for updating was originally proposed in 2021, so it's another old one. This one focuses on the definition of regular employee, specifically on updating the definition to allow subject persons to work remotely and to clarify the contractual relationships that meet the definition of a regular employee. You can probably tell why this rule was originally proposed back in 2021. There's not much more to this one. If this is an area that affects you, I would recommend checking it out. Most of it appears to be based off of feedback surrounding definitions for long-term contractual relationships, among other things. The next upcoming rule action is a change to Part 130 of the ITAR, Part 130 being the section that deals with political contributions, fees, and commissions. This one is the least impactful in my estimation. From what I see, this rule change implements a requirement of the Arms Export Control Act by prescribing regulations for reporting on certain payments relating to the sales of defense articles and defense services. The current thresholds are $5,000 for political contributions and $100,000 for commissions, and the new rule would increase those thresholds and change reporting requirements from transactional to annual. So nothing too exciting in my opinion. Another seemingly small update coming is that there is an IFR scheduled around protective equipment. It seems the list of personal protective equipment covered by ITAR Exemption 123.17 is set to be expanded. Currently, the exemption is for body armor allowed for temporary export, so it seems some additional items will now have access to that exemption. Finally, I want to briefly touch on a current interim final rule that looks set to be finalized as part of this upcoming schedule. The rule in question is exemption for defense trade and cooperation among Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Since this rule is already in effect, and I've undoubtedly covered some of its results through my talks on AUKUS previously, either on this podcast or in the episodes I wrote for the EIB podcast, I'll just give the summary for what this interim final rule from 2024 set out to accomplish. The department amended the ITAR to, quote, facilitate defense trade and cooperation among Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States through a new exemption pursuant to Section 38(1) of the Arms Export Control Act, adding an expedited licensing process for certain defense article and defense service exports to Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada, adding a list of defense articles and defense services excluded from eligibility for transfer under the new exemption for Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and adding to the scope of the exemption for intra-company, intra-organization, and intra-governmental transfers to allow for the transfer of classified defense articles to certain dual nationals who are authorized users within the United Kingdom and Australia. This rule went into effect last year on September 1st, 2024, with comments due by November that year. There may be some alterations as a result of those comments, but the overall goal and result will likely be the same. This was an important step in the construction of our AUKUS deal. There have been some murmurings this year if the deal will stay in place, but so far everything seems to be running smoothly still. If changes to the overall AUKUS partnership occur, you can rest easy knowing that I will be covering it for you. In the meantime, I hope everyone has benefited from the relationship between ourselves, the UK, and Australia. Canada as well, since the rollback of restrictions was done in a way that matches our current trade stance with Canada. But that's our upcoming ITAR schedule. It was a lot, and not all of it will be relevant to you, but all the same, it's important to keep track of. Congress has mandated as part of Section 1345 of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, that the USML will now be reviewed periodically every 3 years. The review and implementation of regulations this episode is covering can be seen as fitting into this new mandate. By engaging with these processes, by paying attention to proposed and interim final rules and taking advantage of comment opportunities, we establish ourselves as influential players in export compliance and the overall government process, consent of the governed and all of that. But more seriously, government is aware on some level that we are the true experts in these areas. And when I say we, I mostly mean you. And as such, our input is vital, which means our attention to these matters is paramount. So yes, this episode most definitely concerns you. Stay in the know, listeners, and stay compliant with export regulations. If you need assistance with that, then please get in touch with us here at AEC. Remember that for all your questions and export compliance needs, contact us here at Aero Export Consultants. Research done right, compliance made simple. I'm John Young, and this has been The Point.